Happy New Year, and we're back for season 2 of Democracy Differently.
We've got some great speakers lined up for you,
including Marlene LaRue, Annalise Dodds MP, and Mike Saywood in the first few episodes.
So tell us about this week's speaker, Jess.
Well, this week we both sat down with Daniel Bruce, who's the CEO of Transparency International UK.
We had a great conversation about how the UK is becoming more corrupt and how it's a harbour for money which props up undemocratic regimes around the world.
I can't wait for everyone to hear it. I think it's a great first episode. Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it.
We're your hosts, Keith Hyams and Jess Sutherland, and we're here today with Daniel Bruce, Chief Executive of Transparency International UK. Today we're going to be talking with Daniel about the influence of corporate money on politics and what we can do about it. Daniel, it's great to have you on the show.
It's good to be here, thank you.
So, as always, the first question we like to ask is, in a sentence, what do you see as the biggest single problem for democracy?
I think the plummeting levels of trust in our politics and our politicians, not just in the UK but around the world, and the risk that if that continues, it will create a crisis of legitimacy and trust for the democratic model in and of itself.
Okay, let's delve into that. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your organisation, Transparency International? What do you do? What countries do you work on?
Yeah, so Transparency International is a global federation of civil society organisations whose vision is a world free from corruption in the lives of ordinary people and in our governments and institutions. And our mission is to hold power to account for the common good to achieve that goal. We have national chapters in about 110 countries around the world at the moment, and so my role is as the head of the UK chapter focused on corruption risks in the UK domestically, whether that's in our politics, companies, institutions, but also the role that the UK needs to play to address its role as so often, unfortunately, an enabler of corruption from around the world.
So historically, the UK likes to see itself as quite a clean democracy. From your vantage point in 2025, how accurate is that perception?
For many years, the UK was a top 10 country out of the 180, had high scores in the sort of mid to high 80s. And then suddenly, with the CPI 2022, we saw one of the most statistically significant falls in the Corruption Perceptions Index in the world. From memory, countries experiencing similar falls that year were Azerbaijan, and one other. So it was in a very very small amount of countries that had a drop that was so significant that year, falling 9 points on the index. The methodology of the index is deliberately designed to be immune to isolated scandal or isolated incidents because it carries some prior year's data with it to smoothen that out. So it takes a lot to get the index to shift that much in one particular year. And that brought the UK down to its lowest ever score. It fell again the year after that, and then at the beginning of this year, it remained static at 71. Now, 71 out of 100, again, is a good score in the context of the overall index, but something I always urge people to do when they look at the CPI is not necessarily to compare it with neighbouring countries or like democracies, but ask your own country, what is actually happening here? And if the direction of travel is a negative one, it shows that there's something underlying that needs to be addressed.
So that drop, that was due to the events going on during the pandemic years, when Johnson was in number 10.
Yeah, so what we're able to do with the index is you can look at the underlying data sets and the specific questions that have been asked that feed into that blended score, and you can see where within individual indicators there has been a particular fall. And the things that came up in those 2 years of significant drop in the UK score were a perception that public money was being diverted because of corrupt practice, that there were high levels of cronyism at the highest levels of government in the UK, and importantly that there were insufficient safeguards for standards and integrity in government. And again, this is not necessarily the views of people in the UK. This is a global perception survey. This is global business leaders, academics, and other experts who are feeding into that survey, who are noticing these things that were going on in the UK, as you say, sort of in those both the pandemic years and the early years coming out of it.
Transparency International recently published a piece where it asked whether the UK has a dark money problem. So what did you mean by this, and what does dark money look like in British politics?
Yeah, we remain very concerned about what we would describe as the corrupting influence of big money in UK politics. And the dark money bit of that is that basically which we simply cannot identify where it's come from. We produced a big study at the end of last year where we'd looked at several years' worth of political donations data from the Electoral Commission. And we found that over a 20-year period, 1 in every £10, 10% of all political donations had come from completely anonymous sources or sources linked to known corruption or sanctioned individuals, for example. So there's a big chunk of many millions of pounds that have gone into UK politics, and we have absolutely no idea where it's come from. And we think that in itself is a problem, and that's why it's dark money, because you just don't know why it's there and where it's come from. And I can get into the detail of how that happens perhaps in a moment. But more generally, we have seen the cost of running political parties and campaigning for elections in the UK has just increased year after year. The election that we had in 2024 was the most expensive general election in history. And in the year prior to that, in terms of all of the donations that went into political parties, again, tens of millions of pounds, 66% of it came from just 19 people. So 19 people funding 2/3 of all of our political party campaigning and sort of operating activity in the UK. Some of that is dark money. Some of it is, big donor money going into this sort of big money politics that we're increasingly seeing in the UK. And so we think it's legitimate to question, if 19 people are paying for the vast majority of political activity in the UK, how is that ensuring that our democracy is actually in the service of our people and is a truly representative democracy?
What does that mean in practice? So can you give some examples where our lives might be better if policy wasn't being shaped by this dark money? What concrete effects does it have for normal voters?
Yes, I mean, it is a difficult thing to find causation between political donation activity and policy outcome. But you can, with a lot of detailed investigatory work, find correlation between certain patterns of activity. A couple of years ago, we decided to look at the housing and construction industry as an example of this, mindful of, the high cost of owning property in the UK, the shortage of housing, and all of those related issues around the cost of living crisis, and so on. And we looked at 10 years of donation data, at a point when the Conservative Party was still the party in government. I think we released the study in 2022, thereabouts. And we found that in the 10 years up to 2020, that the Conservatives, as the party of government, of course, including some coalition years there, received more than 20% of all of its income from a handful of donor sources that came from the property sector, property and construction interests, so major house builders, things like the Bamford empire of JCB and all of those sort of construction industry suppliers. And the vast majority of that 20% again came from about 10% of funders. We also found in that same period that in analysing ministerial meeting data returns from various government departments, that there was an outsized lobbying footprint of the construction and property industry in the same period in terms of the influence that this sector was trying to exert on public policy. And for example, in the same period, there was absolutely no representation in policy meetings that the Department of Housing, Communities and Local Government and other relevant departments were having with the rental sector, and voices representing people who rent their homes. And then we put all of this together, and then a couple of years later, actually, we worked with Channel 4 on a documentary that was looking at a range of sort of policy developments in the climate change mitigation space. And in 2015, there had been a sudden change of heart by government at the time to drop something which was called the Zero Carbon Homes Standard. This was going to be a new house building standard that was designed to make sure that basically new homes were net zero. They weren't putting carbon into the atmosphere. And there had been very, very heavy lobbying by the construction and house building industry and property industry against this legislation at the time. And when we triangulated this with our data, you could see that in 2014 and 15, there was this huge spike in political donations going into the party of government from the property and construction sector. So you can make of that what you will as an example, but it shows that when you start to pull together these disparate bits of information about what's really going on in our democracy and what's really influencing policy making, there is certainly a correlating relationship that you can find between political party financing patterns, the influence that outside lobbyists are trying to have on policy, and what then actually happens with government policy.
So why does the UK have such a problem with regulating this political money? Is it just a failure of political will, for example, or institutional design or incentives are actually baked into our system? What's going on?
Well, political parties want money to win elections, and it's that is the elephant in the room, and bluntly. This is an area where turkeys generally won't vote for Christmas, despite the evidence that is laid before them. The Committee on Standards in Public Life, about 13-14 years ago, took a long, hard look into political financing in the UK, and it recommended that there should be a cap on political donations in the UK per person per year of £10,000 at the time. Multiple governments of multiple complexions have not adopted that recommendation or anything close to it, and today we still have a limitless ceiling on how much individuals or companies can put into political parties of their choice in the UK. Now, for a long time, there was an argument that when the Conservative Party was the party of government, they historically have had more dependency on a small number of high-value donors, whereas the Labour Party, again, traditionally has received more grassroots support, smaller donations from a greater number of people, and particularly through its links to the trade union movement, of course. That started to change in the 2024 election when Labour perhaps almost surprised itself by the high volume of multi-million pound donations that it was able to raise for its election machine, and it outraised the Conservative Party by a considerable margin. And so then you get a change of government, and then you have a different government of a different complexion with its hands on the levers of power, and it partly will have got there because of the amount of money it was able to spend on its electoral operation. Those two things go hand in glove. So it's a difficult argument with parties that both want to be able to compete with the party of government and parties that have successfully won an election campaign having outraised some of their fellow parties. But it's a pernicious issue which I'm afraid won't go away, and is something which, through polling data we know is hugely unpalatable to the public.
So we talked about UK donors. What about foreign money? Is that a problem in UK politics as well?
Yes, this has been a concern for some time, that partly because of the anonymity gaps that I mentioned earlier, that it has been both possible, and it's been found to be possible, that what would otherwise be illegal foreign donations, because the principle of the law is that only UK or voters registered on the UK electoral roll or UK registered companies should be able to put money into UK political parties, because that's in their constituency interest, and that if you allow any foreign donations and any foreign influence, that influence could potentially be malign and could come from regimes that are hostile to the UK and would seek to undermine our democracy by putting money into the system. So that's the risk that we're trying to avoid. But for years, corporate donations have been able to, perhaps hide through shell companies, through the overseas territories, offshore financial centres. Then all of our political parties, to one extent or another, have relied on a vehicle called unincorporated associations, and these, as their name would suggest, are just informal collections of people, often used for local community groups and the like, that might be raising money to, restore a village green or something, but also that have increasingly been used by grassroots political party associations associations to bring money into the system. And we found that the amount of money coming from unincorporated associations in the sort of millions of dark money that I described earlier was again in the millions. It's completely untraceable. So there are all these sort of back doors that can and which have been utilised by foreign donors who would not otherwise meet the permissibility rules. The Labour government has introduced a number of measures which will tighten up on that, by closing some of the back doors, by lowering the transparency threshold, so we can actually see more of what is going into the political system, and that is welcome. But we still think we need to go further.
If we move across the pond then, so away from British politics for a second, I think many observers see the US as a kind of very dramatic case of democratic backsliding, and it's definitely something we spoke about on the podcast before with other guests. So what lessons do you think the UK should draw from the American experience that they're having now or previously?
Yeah, and actually, again, if I look at the Corruption Perceptions Index, the United States score has been going south for quite a few years now, and that would correlate with some of the general sentiment of concern around the health of American democracy. What have we seen happen so far in sort of a year of Trump Mark II? In our space as anti-corruption campaigners, we have a very lengthy list of examples of the Trump administration using extensive use of executive power that the president has to hollow out the protections that US democracy has from corruption at great speed as well in the early months of this administration. So examples would be ceasing implementation of the United States Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. This was the gold standard of international bribery laws that prevents companies from paying bribes to foreign officials, and it was a feared piece of legislation. And the Department of Justice in the US was a proud enforcer of that legislation, and we've seen various companies with dubious reputations of foreign bribery absolutely clobbered with enormous fines under the FCPA, which has acted as a real deterrent to corrupt practice in US and other international companies' trading practices around the world. So enforcement of that act has gone. It's still there as a piece of legislation, but it's basically not being taken seriously anymore. Two very important counter-kleptocracy initiatives in the US, to stop dirty money from the proceeds of corruption and authoritarian regimes infecting the US economy. They've been dismantled. There's been an absolute gutting of anti-money laundering laws in the UK. There's been the use of presidential pardon to reverse sanctions on foreign corrupt individuals from authoritarian and dictatorial regimes. And you see the president using his own personal assets and property and other arrangements to provide services to the government that he is running, obviously at financial benefit to himself and to his business empire. And so these are all things that my colleagues at Transparency International in the US have pointed out. I guess your question was, what is the learning? The learning is, I guess, that if you have an administration that doesn't care much for controls on corruption and high standards and the prevention of the facilitation of global corruption, it shows that even in a democracy it can be quite easy to dismantle those protections and corruptions. But I guess where it differs from the UK, of course, is the extent of executive power that the president of the US has relative to a prime minister in the UK, and the kind of sovereign nature of Parliament. And of course, that's had its tests in recent years as well. But perhaps, therefore, the learning is how important parliamentary scrutiny is in a democracy to keep executive power in check.
You've said already we're going down a route that we wouldn't really want to go down in terms of corruption, but could we end up in the same boat as the US, or do you think those protections are sufficient to kind of temper how bad it's going to get in the UK?
Well, our unwritten constitution is very different to the constitution of the US, isn't it? And the sort of three branches of government and the way they interact in the US are very different. We don't have in theory, we don't have the politicized nature of, judicial appointments that you have in the US. And again, we don't have that extent of executive power. So I think, again, it shows the importance of underpinning the democratic conventions and safeguards that we have, particularly without a written constitution. What worries us again, is that big money problem, though, and the corrupting influence of big money, because, again, successive governments in the UK have not tackled the really thorny challenges of this. And as I've explained already, we've seen spending patterns and donation habits only increasing. Now, if we look across the pond, the sort of £94 million that was spent on the 2024 election in the UK looks like considerably small change compared to how much got spent in the billions of dollars on the US presidential campaign. So, colleagues in the US, campaigners in the US might say, what are you worrying about? You haven't got this multi-billion-dollar electoral machine that is all powerful in the US, and really kind of props up very much that kind of two-candidate system that we've seen for many decades now. But what it does show is that money is power in elections in the US, and the US is just the most obtuse example of that. And at the minute in the UK, still, we are doing nothing about that. And if there is that intrinsic relationship between money and power in our politics, rather than democratic power in our politics, then I think we should remain very concerned.
So this idea that we all have one vote, therefore it's democratic, is completely undermined by the fact that actually it's not just the votes that count, it's the money.
John Major, our former Prime Minister, gave a speech at the Institute for Government a few months ago where he bemoaned many of the issues I've referenced already. He's become a very outspoken critic of the sort of standards and integrity record of his party in government in recent years, but also the wider political system. And referring to the activities of Elon Musk in particular in the US, he said it used to be in our democracies that it was one person, one vote, and now it seems to be one person and however much money they've got in terms of the influence that they want to have. And this was particularly in the heat of the moment after it was suggested that Elon Musk might make $100 million donation to the Reform UK Party. Now, there are questions as to the legitimacy of that as a foreign donation, and you had members of the Reform Party openly on the media explaining how they might work around the controls in the system that we have at the moment to get that donation into their bank account. But, if you look at the impact of Mr. Musk in the US, you might recall he was going around essentially offering multi-million-dollar raffle prizes to voters if they entered a raffle to say that they would vote for President Trump. Should money buy votes in a democracy? Probably not. And there you had him in those early months in the White House in an unelected position, one of the world's richest men, almost overnight, closing down the largest humanitarian assistance operation in the world in the form of USAID, and nobody voted for Musk, and nobody voted for that as a policy position. But again, his deep pockets got him into the position that he was in, with the proximity to the president. So we cannot underestimate the power of the bank balance and the influence that it's having in democracies, obviously in the US, here, and around the world.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And if we move away perhaps from UK and US politics for a second and go back to looking at corruption in the rest of the world, it seems that quite a lot of this corruption is kind of bolstered by dirty money, like you said before, that flows through different offshore networks that are linked to London, New York, Zurich, for example. Can you explain why Britain became such a hub for this type of dirty money?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because the UK, for some years now, has found itself with this rather dubious reputation for rolling out the red carpet for kleptocrats, oligarchs, and corrupt foreign officials and leaders who have plundered their own country's resources at the expense of their population, only to buy themselves expensive flats in Mayfair and develop very expensive shopping habits at Harrods and put their kids through the most expensive educational institutions in this country. Why the UK in particular? I mean, it's not the only one. The US has had its issues again. Switzerland is slightly different, but there is something about the City of London, of course, being the global financial centre that it is, coupled with an erstwhile democratically and economically stable environment, coupled with the luxury lifestyle that if you've got the cash that you can afford to pay for in the United Kingdom, and London in particular is a very attractive city to a lot of international individuals who wish to both launder and wash their money, their ill-gotten gains, through very luxurious and lavish lifestyles here in the UK. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, a couple of years ago we looked at 400 well-known corruption cases from around the world, involving corrupted funds from dozens and dozens of countries, be they very poverty-stricken countries in sub-Saharan Africa in particular, or countries like Russia and China, and emerging economic centres like Nigeria and Kenya, and funds from all of these countries feature this. And 400 known cases involving 325 billion pounds of illegitimately obtained financial gains, and we wanted to understand who had helped that money come to the UK, and we found links in those cases to 600 UK companies and institutions. Now, that included dozens of banks, dozens of lawyers and accounting firms, the obvious suspects, if you like, for the kinds of services you're going to be able to need to be able to use to bring that money into the country. But the surprises were things like the architects and interior designers, or luxury lifestyle advisors, or florists, who again were in many cases unwittingly finding themselves moving the proceeds of corruption into the UK economy. But there were also those actors who were complicit in some of those cases, where the professioning and labelling industries were choosing to look the other way and not ask uncomfortable questions about the sources of their clients' wealth. And so you have this whole industry in the UK. You have this attractive lifestyle, attractive economy, and a whole industry that will enable dirty money to find its way into the UK. And for many years we had incentives for it. It was the Labour government of Tony Blair that created the UK's golden visa system, where if you had £10 million spare, you could buy yourself a UK passport and live here happily ever after. And it was only actually after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that the Johnson government shut that down.
Is this something we should be confronting the government more about? Do we need more regulation of this kind of practice?
Well, actually, I have to say, I think in many ways this has been more of a success story in recent years. There's been more readiness and willingness, probably from around about the Cameron government of 2016, to accept that this was an issue. You might recall that there was this rather embarrassing incident when David Cameron, when he was still Prime Minister, very, very motivated by the issues in this space, he convened an anti-corruption summit in 2016, and in some of the media activity around that, he was famously caught on mic when he thought he wasn't, describing Nigeria as a country that was fabulously corrupt. And he was invited to apologise to the president of Nigeria, and the president said, "I don't want your apology, I just want the money back that's sitting in bank accounts in your country, please, Mr. Cameron." And from there we have seen commitments came out of that summit to deal with the systemic issues that allow the UK and other global financial centres to become repositories for dirty money. For example, introducing what's called beneficial ownership transparency, so our ability to be able to see who owns assets, be it properties or companies, and deal with significant issues in the so-called secrecy jurisdictions of the overseas territories and crown dependencies of the UK. For years we have been campaigning, for example, for an end to the ability to own property anonymously in the UK, because property so often was the kind of real target for some of these illicit funds, because you can both hide it in property anonymously and let its value grow. So not only can you conceal your money, but you can double your returns quite quickly, particularly if you buy well in certain parts of London. And it was only after, again, Russia's full scale of Ukraine that the Johnson government brought forward economic crime legislation to introduce transparency over offshore property ownership, and then furthermore to bring forward measures that would stop the use and abuse of the UK's company registration system, to buy properties through shell companies, and all of these sorts of things. So we've actually come a long way in the last decade. We've recognised the problem. Successive governments have recognised that it's an issue and have tried to take various levels of action through legislation and regulation to deal with it. We're not there yet. There are still loopholes. And we're particularly pleased that the current government will be convening an illicit finance summit in June of 2026 to bring together at least 20 countries to sort of really diplomatically push on the next steps on this issue.
There's a lot of solutions you've kind of spoken a little bit about there, but I know that you've also welcomed moves towards a new ethics commission, but emphasised that it really needs to be truly independent. So what would a kind of empowered ethics regulator actually look like in this space?
Yeah, this was something that the Labour government promised in opposition. Actually, it first announced plans for a speech when Angela Rayner was still the deputy leader, and we were sort of in peak Partygate season. And Labour in opposition said, if we win power at the next election, we're going to sort this out. We're going to introduce an Ethics and Integrity Commission. And the impression that was given at the time that this was going to be something significant, with teeth, independent, with investigatory powers and so on, to deal with any allegations of misconduct or corrupt practice or failures in standards at the highest levels of government. What's happened so far is that in October of 2025, the Ethics and Integrity Commission was created, essentially by rebranding what used to be called the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which was a sort of arm's-length advisory body originally set up by John Major after the Cash for Questions affair in the 1990s. And it had been there to review the standards landscape and provide advice on standards issues and the political finance issues that I mentioned earlier. So it's now become the Commission, which will have a sort of oversight role of the sort of ethics and standards regulatory landscape across government, including in local government in the UK, which is welcome. However, there is some irony in that its predecessor body, the Committee on Standards in Public Life, 4 years ago, produced 34 very well thought through recommendations to improve the ethics and integrity landscape in government in the UK. The Conservative government introduced 4 of those recommendations. The Labour government has delivered 2, so we still have 28 that are outstanding. And in time-honoured fashion, they're the 28 more difficult ones, but they're really important because what they would do would improve the resilience of the ethics and integrity landscape. They would ensure that you couldn't sweep away the checks and balances that are there on prime ministerial and governmental power. It would deal with long-standing issues more fully, such as the revolving door of politicians leaving government and going on to highly paid roles in business, working on the brief that they used to be working on as a government minister, for example. So we haven't really resolved that. So there's quite a long way to go to give it the teeth and underpinning that it really needs to work effectively, in our view.
What kind of measures would you like to see put in place to deal with those issues?
Well, I think foremost among them would be a statutory underpinning for some of the critical aspects of it, so that there is a requirement in law for the Commission to exist, so that there is a requirement in law for the independent advisor on ministerial interests, the so-called Prime Minister's ethics advisor, to be enshrined in law, and that they go through a proper independent public appointments process at the minute they're appointed at the whim of the Prime Minister of the day, and that there is a requirement in law for the Prime Minister to issue the ministerial code. We'd also like to see the rules that govern that post-governmental employment, the so-called revolving door, the rules themselves strengthened and given a statutory footing, because that's a pernicious issue that really eats into public trust as well, when they see ministers going off and earning these megabucks salaries using the advantage that's been given to them by political and public service. But the biggest concern really is making sure that it's future proof, that you have a system that doesn't follow the ebb and flow of whoever's in government, but which is demonstrably independent. And also, I hear from our elected politicians' perspective, they don't want to feel that they are accountable to unelected individuals. They want to feel that they're accountable to their electorate. And there is a tension there between those two things. So that's why I think the appointments processes around these independent bodies needs to be fully open, fully transparent, time-bound appointments that can be defended and have various fail-safes in them as well.
So why is it that various different attempts, perhaps these 28 points or other attempts that have gone on, are just any attempt to kind of improve the integrity, they often just fail to cross the finish line? They might have these recommendations, but they're not ever implemented.
Yeah, a phrase I've used a lot in recent months when sort of reflecting on where we've got to is there are quite a lot of things that just feel a bit undercooked. There's some good intent that's been displayed. Again, the Labour Party in its manifesto going into 2024's election made a welcome and surprising number of commitments of concern to us in sort of ethics and integrity and prevention of corruption area. But what we've seen in delivery thus far have been steps in the right direction, but without that sort of resilience needed that I've described. We do now, as of December, have a new anti-corruption strategy for the UK, which we welcome, and it is actually very candid and frank on the corruption risks that the UK faces domestically, including political corruption, which was silent in the last strategy, which was almost 10 years ago. And it's candid on the threats that the UK faces externally from corrupt actors and those who seek to use and abuse the UK in their nefarious activity. And it's got 120 commitments in it, all of which are very welcome. If they were all delivered, and that's going to be a challenge over the life of the Parliament, they would go some way, actually, to addressing these corruption threats and risks that the UK faces. But still within that 120, there is a bit of silence on those issues that I've mentioned a lot: political financing, ambition, capping donations, and bringing real statutory strength to the regulation of standards and ethics in government to ensure that our democratically elected leaders are acting solely in the public interest and not in the vested interest of political forces or financial forces around them. Why don't these things happen? I think on the political finance side, we've talked already about the fact that it's hard to break this cycle of needing money to win, and who is going to be the first government, the first minister to make that jump and really say, actually, no, this is the direction that we're going in. Interestingly, in Australia, in early 2025, the Australian Labor Party went into its general election campaign promising to introduce a cap on individual donations per year of 50,000 Australian dollars. So what's that, sort of 23,000, 24,000 pounds ish. And it surprised itself and won that election and won a new mandate, where that was a very high profile campaign promise, where public dissatisfaction with the clear influence of big money in Australian politics had really, really boiled over. And sometimes it takes a moment like that to really, really push things further. I hope we don't get to needing a really big scandal, a really big moment to seeing that happen in the UK, but to actually look at what's happened in other countries and been delivered quite successfully in response to demand from the electorate. On the sort of standards and integrity side, there is this constitutional push-pull, and I understand that. Again, I'm sympathetic to elected individuals saying, why I'm accountable to my electorate, I'm not accountable to a civil servant or some arm's length body official over there. So that needs to be worked through. But Parliament can and does legislate to regulate other parts of government and the executive. It's not constitutionally impossible. So the very short answer to your question is also often it's about political will or lack of it.
Thanks, Daniel. So we always like to move on to a quick fire round towards the end. So we're going to ask you a number of questions. Can you try and answer in one sentence? So firstly, what country could the UK learn most from right now?
Well, right now I'm going to say Australia because of its work on political donations. There are others like Ireland and Canada who have better aspects of transparency in their democratic systems, but Australia is a case in point, I think.
What's the biggest risk to integrity in UK politics right now?
Inertia, I think, and just, we know what needs to be done, but it's getting it done and getting the political will behind it.
What do you think are the most underrated and the most overrated anti-corruption tools?
I would say the most underrated, on a topic we haven't touched upon at all yet, would be transparent public spending and public procurement systems. Absolutely transformative in places like Ukraine, which pre-war and during war saved tens of millions of dollars by massive digital transformation of its public spending, and it embarrassed countries like the UK during the pandemic for how it was able to go about that. So good technical systems that protect public money. Overrated, I would say countries that reach for creating a single anti-corruption commission or body to give all of the country's corruption problems to one place, because it creates a single point of failure.
Yeah.
And what's a reform that you once believed in but now you no longer do?
Maybe not a single reform, but perhaps a belief in a set of reforms that are solely about laws and regulation. And I know I've talked about that a lot, but you need those, but they don't solve the problem alone. You have to have a culture of integrity as well, and you have to have beliefs and will and political judgment that supports these reforms.
One thing you'd like to see Transparency International doing that it's not currently doing?
Well, in the UK context, I'd love for us to be doing more in local government. There are hundreds of local councils up and down the country, and all too often we hear that, particularly when it comes to planning and property development, that's where ordinary people see corruption at the end of their street. We're not doing enough to expose that and deal with those risks at the minute, and that's something I want us to be able to find the resources to do in the future.
Yeah.
What got you interested in working in this area in the first place?
Well, from the very beginning of my working life in my late teens, I'd seen a bit of appalled and had my blood boiled by abuses of power in education, in local government, and the police, and began my working life as a journalist actually, and then trained journalists all around the world to hold power to account. And then when this opportunity came along to really zero in on corrupt practice and the abuse of power day in day out, it was perfect for my personal motivations, and really just represents a thread that's run through my whole career.
So maybe you've just answered this question, but what keeps you awake at night?
I really do worry when I see data that suggests lots of young people across Europe, for example, sometimes a majority, don't believe in democracy anymore. Democracy has to be the bedrock upon which we build everything I've talked about, and if democracy loses its legitimacy, then we have real problems.
Let's end the quickfire on a hopeful note, hopefully. So what keeps you hopeful?
I know that we can change things. It takes time and patience and perseverance, but I know that arguments around integrity and public standards and doing the right thing do eventually win the day, but we have to persist.
Thank you. So we always end with the same final question. So we asked you at the start, what's the biggest problem with democracy right now? So to end with, in one sentence, if you could choose one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be?
Make sure it's not for sale.
Good answer.
Daniel, thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you so much.
We hope you've enjoyed the podcast. If you have, don't forget to subscribe and follow us on social media. We've been your hosts, Keith Hyams.
And Jess Sutherland.
Thanks for tuning in.